She was worth $4.5 billion. Forbes put her on the cover and called her the youngest self-made female billionaire in America. She wore the same black turtleneck as Steve Jobs, spoke in this deep, deliberate voice, and told the world she had invented a machine that could run over 200 medical tests from a single drop of blood. There was just one problem. The machine didn't work. Not worked slowly. Not needed a few more years. It did not work. And she knew it. This is the story of Elizabeth Holmes and the company called Theranos. And I want to be clear about what this story is actually about. Because the easy version is, a young woman lied, got caught, went to prison. The end. Feels good. Justice served. But that version skips the part that should genuinely bother you. Elizabeth Holmes didn't fool a handful of gullible people. She fooled some of the most powerful, most experienced, most supposedly brilliant men in the country. 2 former secretaries of state, a future secretary of defense, one of the biggest media moguls on earth. And the uncomfortable question I keep coming back to is this: how did every single one of them forget to check? In 2003, Elizabeth Holmes was 19 years old, a sophomore studying chemical engineering at Stanford, and she dropped out. She took the money her parents had saved for her college tuition and she used it to start a company. She called it Theranos. The name is a mashup of therapy and diagnosis, which honestly tells you everything about how she thought. Every detail was engineered to sound like the future. And the pitch was genuinely beautiful. Think about the last time you got blood drawn. The needle, the vials, the waiting. Now imagine none of that. A single tiny prick on your fingertip, 1 or 2 drops of blood, and from that, over 240 tests. Cholesterol, cancer markers, everything. Fast and cheap, a fraction of what the labs charged. If that were real, it would change medicine. It would change your life. And that's the thing about a great lie. The best ones aren't the ones people fall for despite wanting the truth. The best ones are the lies people are desperate to believe. Here's where Holmes was genuinely a genius, and I don't say that lightly. Not at science. At storytelling. She worshipped Steve Jobs. And she didn't hide it, she cloned it. She wore the exact same black turtleneck every single day, even in the brutal Silicon Valley summer heat. She was naturally a higher-voiced woman, but former employees testified in court that she deliberately lowered her voice into this deep, magnetic baritone. Why? Because she was a young woman walking into rooms full of older, powerful men, and she needed them to take her seriously. So she built a character. She performed authority until people just handed it to her. And it worked. God, did it work. By 2013 and 2014, at its peak, Theranos had raised over $700 million. The company was valued at $9 billion. And because Holmes personally held more than half of it, Forbes estimated her net worth at $4.5 billion and crowned her the youngest self-made female billionaire in America. But the money is not the crazy part. Look at who agreed to sit on her board. Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of State. George Shultz, another former Secretary of State. James Mattis, the general they called Mad Dog, who would later become Secretary of Defense. People called it the most impressive board in the history of American business. And it was a board of statesmen and generals, not one of whom, as far as anyone can tell, understood the actual science of what she was selling. And it didn't stop there. Rupert Murdoch, the media titan, personally invested $125 million. He would go on to lose every penny. So why did they say yes? Here's my honest answer. The thesis of this whole video. They didn't check because the story was too good to check. Kissinger didn't invest because he'd read the lab data. Murdoch didn't write a check because he understood microfluidics. They believed because everyone around them believed, and because being early on the next Steve Jobs was more exciting than the boring, unglamorous work of asking, wait, can I actually see this machine run? That's not a technology failure. That's a human one. And it's about to get people hurt. Because in 2013, this stopped being a story about rich investors and started being a story about you. Theranos struck a nationwide deal with Walgreens, one of the biggest pharmacy chains in America. They opened what they called wellness centers right inside the stores, where regular people, real patients, could walk in and get their blood drawn. They signed a similar deal with the supermarket giant Safeway. Suddenly, this fantasy machine wasn't in a pitch deck anymore. It was drawing blood from actual human beings who trusted it to tell them whether they were sick. And here's what was really happening behind the curtain. Theranos had built a device. They nicknamed it Edison, and Edison was, to put it plainly, a prop. It didn't work. Its error rates were wildly high. It would leak blood. It could not do what she promised. So what did they do when real patients showed up? They cheated. Secretly, in a back lab, they took those tiny blood samples, diluted them down, and ran them on standard commercial machines they'd bought from other companies, machines made by Siemens. Then they printed the results on a report and pretended their magic box had done it. Sit with that. Real people, worried about real diseases, were getting results from a system the company knew was unreliable. Some got told they were sick when they weren't. Some got told they were fine. That's not fraud against investors anymore. That's playing with people's lives. And empires this big don't fall on their own. Someone has to push. That someone was a Wall Street Journal investigative reporter named John Carreyrou. On October 15, 2015, he published a report that ripped the first hole in the $9 billion wall. And he did not do it easily. Theranos came after him with everything. They hired David Boies, one of the most feared lawyers in the country. Carreyrou describes being followed, surveilled, threatened. The full weight of $1 billion company came down to keep him quiet. But he had something they couldn't buy. He had insiders. Former employees who could not live with what they'd seen. One of them was named Tyler Shultz. And here's the detail that turns this from a business scandal into a Shakespeare play. Tyler Shultz was the grandson of George Shultz, the former Secretary of State on the Theranos board. A young man went up against his own famous grandfather, against a company, against an army of lawyers, to tell the truth. Carreyrou later put the whole investigation into a best-selling book called Bad Blood. Read it. It's incredible. Now, no story about Holmes is complete without Sunny Balwani. Ramesh Sunny Balwani was the company's president and chief operating officer. He was also, secretly, Elizabeth Holmes's boyfriend. There was a 19-year age gap between them, and they hid the relationship from investors and the board for years. And when the whole thing collapsed, and Holmes finally stood trial, her defense was, let's say, dramatic. She broke down in tears and testified that Sunny had subjected her to years of psychological abuse, control, and manipulation. The implication was clear. Don't blame me. I was a victim too. I'm not going to tell you what happened between two people behind closed doors, but I will tell you what the jury decided, because they did not fully buy it. In January 2022, Elizabeth Holmes was found guilty on 4 counts of fraud. That November, she was sentenced to 11.25 years in prison. On May 30th, 2023, she reported to a federal facility in Texas to begin serving her time. Sunny Balwani got it worse. He was convicted on all 12 fraud counts against him and sentenced to nearly 13 years. And the court ordered the two of them to jointly pay back their defrauded investors a staggering $452 million. So there it is. The turtleneck is gone. The deep voice, the magazine covers, the $9 billion valuation, all of it, reduced to a prison number and a debt she will likely never fully repay. Forbes, which once called her a self-made billionaire, quietly revised her estimated net worth to a single perfect number, 0. And that feels good, right? The liar lost. The truth won. Justice. But before you close this video feeling satisfied, come back to the question we started with. Because I don't think the scariest part of this story is Elizabeth Holmes, the scariest part is this. She was not some criminal mastermind operating in the shadows. She did everything in broad daylight. She stood on stages, gave interviews, put her face on covers, and told a story that anyone with the right expertise could have poked holes in. And for years, almost nobody did. Not the billionaires. Not the statesmen. not the retail giants who put her machines in front of real patients. Why? Because we have built a culture that rewards the story more than the substance. Silicon Valley even has a phrase for it. Fake it till you make it. Project Confidence. Sell the dream. Worry about whether it's real later. Elizabeth Holmes didn't invent that game. She just played it better and longer than anyone, until the gap between the story and the truth got so wide that people started getting hurt. So her scariest lie was never the machine. The machine was just a box. Her real trick was convincing the smartest people in America that if the story is good enough and the storyteller is confident enough, nobody needs to check whether it's true. And that trick still works. Look at half the funding rounds and product launches in your feed right now. The same certainty, the same visionary framing, the same reluctance in the room to be the one who asks the dumb question. There is another Elizabeth Holmes out there right now, on a stage, in a pitch meeting, wearing their own version of the black turtleneck, telling a story that's just too good to question. The only real defense we ever had against her wasn't the FBI, or the jury, or even Carreyrou. It was one boring, unglamorous, deeply unfashionable question. The one everybody in the room was too excited, too greedy, or too afraid to ask. Can you actually show me it works? Ask it more often. It's the cheapest insurance you'll ever have.